So thank you so much for coming on to today's stream. I really appreciate it. I want to start off by giving you an opportunity to introduce yourself for people who might not be familiar with your work and the background you have generally, your field of experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hi everyone. I'm Dmitry Grozoubinski. I'm Dmitry Opines on Twitter. I'm a former Australian diplomat and former Australian trade negotiator. Basically, what I do is I try to explain trade policy to people in the way that they get it. So governments will bring me in to train their negotiators. Civil society groups will get me in to train their guys who try to change policy for the better. Companies will get me in to explain what the hell trade policy is to like their entire C-suite and that kind of thing. And so that's basically what I do. I have a consultancy that I run in Geneva called Explain Trade, and I run a think tank there for the Swiss government. Also, I guess my background is I was born in Ukraine, and I found myself with a reasonably sized Twitter following at the start of the Ukraine war. And like a lot of people who feel a really strong connection to what's happening over there, but sort of aren't Ukrainian citizens and wouldn't be any use to anybody in a trench with a rocket-propelled grenade, I spent a lot of my time kind of fighting the good fight online, translating Russian stuff into English so you guys can read what these lunatics are saying when they think no one's listening, pushing back on Mershima and others using the platform that I have. So that's kind of me. That's who I am. That's what I do.
I gotta say that some of the most convincing material for me on this war hasn't been from Westerners, it has been from the Russians themselves, by going out and watching Russian state media, by going out and listening to Russian heads of either Dmitry Medvedev, Shoigu, Gerasimov, any of these government officials, the stuff that's meant for a domestic audience that was certainly never going to be aired normally on Russia Today, the English-speaking version, just taking that and having people like Julia Davis or War Translated or other people who take the time to go out there and actually watch this slop and translate it for English speakers. That material has been so useful. But you don't even need to go to those people. You can just go listen to Putin directly, like his essay before the war where he explains his motives. Like, Ukraine can only exist as part of Russia. It can only exist as an extension of Russia. So it either exists as an extension of Russia or it doesn't exist at all. And those motives are laid out just so clearly. And man, what a language barrier can do for your perception of this war is immense.
So one of the things people need to understand about like the former Soviet Union, especially Russia, is that we in the West are currently watching people speed run shamelessness that these guys have unlocked all of the achievements on for decades. So something that you'll see a lot with, say, like Trump, is you'll be watching and he'll be saying stuff. And for us, we're watching, we're like, why is he just telling us the crime? Like, why does he keep just confessing? How does he not get in trouble when he says things at the quiet part out loud? Politicians in Russia have been saying the quiet part out loud or saying things that are so obviously untrue that it seems impossible that they should be able to say it and not immediately like burst into flames. They've been doing it for like 70 years. So there's this kind of presumption on their part that nothing that comes out of their mouths matters because for their domestic audience, it almost kind of doesn't. Not in the same way that it does in the West. And we're only slowly getting to that. So indeed, like taking the stuff that they're saying to their own people and translating it, hugely, hugely effective in being eye-opening and pushing back on some of this Dostoevsky Russian soul bullshit that you get from some commentators who really should know better.
I mean, when I see like the Novgorodka Dam explosion, and I was in Kherson during that. I recorded a lot of the response there and the Russian targeted of aid workers. When I see that and I see how the Russians talk about it, or about any event like that, it seems like they're just kind of standing at a target board, like a dart board, and they're just throwing like dart after dart after dart after dart, throwing theory after story after idea after idea. And if now, are all these things going to convince everyone? No. In fact, Russian public trust in state media has tremendously gone down during the course of this war even if they have, I think, bred, and I think this is the main point of this, a political apathy. If you don't know what's true, if everything could be true or not true, and you can kind of pick and choose your own reality, then maybe you don't necessarily believe all the propaganda. Maybe you don't disbelieve all the propaganda. Maybe you just don't know what's true and what isn't true. It's too much of an effort to figure out yourself anyway. You've got a 9 to 5. There's a war going on. Everything sucks. Don't worry about it. Just keep your head down and keep going. I think when you can't tell what is true and what is not true, there's no basis for political action.
I think that's absolutely right. I was on the ground in Ukraine right after MH17 went down. I was part of the Australian task force that was sort of doing the diplomacy to try to get the bodies back and the right to investigate the crash site and stuff. And like the Russians were just machine gunning insane theories. And it is precisely for the reason that you described, which is they're not necessarily trying...
Could you throw out a few of those theories if you remember them? Because because this is the thing that gets me. At the start of this war, there were so many theories about chemical weapons being developed in Ukrainian biolabs. 2 years later, we found no evidence. There's been nothing presented. They've basically forgotten about the story in its entirety. And these fanciful stories are just gone from public consciousness completely. And that's where they want to keep them, because if you kind of sit back for a second and be like, wait a minute, what was that thing 2 years ago? Why did we never follow up on that? And when you do follow up and you look at the original stuff, it's always like 10 times crazier than you would have expected, considering that there's nothing to support it.
Oh man, the theories, I remember that, they started off by just going, nothing happened. The second theory was it's a Ukrainian ground-to-air missile. The third theory was it was a Ukrainian jet, and this is one that they took all the way to, I think, the Hague trial. They argued it was a Ukrainian plane. Then for a while, and you can still find news stories about this if you go back to 2014, they argued that it was a Ukrainian jet attempting to shoot down a plane because they believed Putin was on it. They legitimately pushed the argument that it was an assassination attempt on Putin gone wrong on the part of the Ukrainian military. They were just flooding this stuff out.
There's so many layers to of just making no sense. I know we didn't say this clearly, but MH17 was a plane that was flying over Ukraine that was shot down by Russian-backed forces in Ukraine early on during the ATO, the anti-terrorism operation against the rebellion in the Donbass. That was a huge diplomatic spat between the Dutch and the Russians. The Russians denied it, but the evidence is piled up to a point where it is undeniable. But the thing that gets me about that is it doesn't even make practical sense. Why would Putin, in a country that he's invading, get in a civilian airliner and travel across it? It doesn't even make practical sense.
So the theory was something like that. The radar signature of Putin's plane, so their equivalent of Air Force One, is similar enough. Because keep in mind, like the thing that made MH17 different from most other things is that, yes, it was a civilian airliner, but it was a civilian airliner traveling at like normal cruising altitude. They didn't shoot this thing down with a Stinger or like a shoulder-mounted manpad. They shot it down with a BUK, right? So the reason that you can generally civilian airliners are generally pretty safe from like terrorists on the ground is that you can't kill one of these things with a shoulder-mounted missile when it's all the way up in the air. This is why you will see, civilian airlines fly over places that are sort of fairly rough, because they're like your average like Al-Qaeda guy in the desert with a shoulder-mounted thing that he can use to fire at like Hind Russian helicopters can't turn around and take down a Boeing 777. Although it turns out Boeings will just take themselves out apparently, because they've like forgotten to put doors on them. But setting that aside, so the idea was like when you're looking at this thing on a radar on like a BUK system, all you've got is like there's a blip up there. It's pretty big. it's moving in a certain direction, and if you're not connected to Russian air traffic control, you don't know what it is. So that was kind of, I mean, it was dumb, but yeah, that's kind of how the logic went. That they didn't think that he was on a civilian airline. They thought, the theory goes, they thought they were shooting, but then like with a jet, it doesn't make any sense. Sorry, I don't know why I'm still manning this. It's too dumb to say out loud.
I'm sure we'll get some new evidence soon that will exonerate the Russians. I do want to ask. So, at the time of this, I was very young. I was too young to be interested in politics. I was like playing Minecraft, probably, right? Around this time, when you start to get these signals, the Russians invade Ukraine while they lie about it the whole time in 2014.
Yeah.
They then proceed to fight a shadow war in Ukraine for practically a decade, funneling weapons during the nighttime through train lines. Anytime where the rebels start to have troubles, they just kind of cross the army over, have them take off their insignias, and intervene on their behalf. What we're now finding out much later about the Russians targeting Czech production facilities that were producing weapons meant for Ukraine. That means targeting production, doing industrial sabotage on NATO member states in 2014. Why was this not a big wake-up call when it feels like it should have been a big wake-up call at the time for people who were not paying attention as these signs started to rear their ugly heads? And it felt like the Obama administration and the preceding Trump administration and early Biden administrations somewhat stuck their head in the sand to the issue.
So the best explanation I can give for this is that Putin established a very effective strategy for neutralizing the West, which is that, look, the West is pretty reluctant to get involved to begin with. And the best way to ensure that they don't get involved is by muddying the waters and avoiding the creation of a clear narrative with good guys and bad guys. And they did this very well initially in Georgia, even before anything started in Ukraine. They did this in Georgia, where they sort of muddied the waters a lot. They made it confusing about who attacked who. They sort of blamed the president at the time, and they didn't advance all the way to the capital. And so the West was like, ugh, like it'd be way too hard to explain to the American people why we're suddenly intervening in Georgia. It's all way too hard. We need cooperation with Russia. We'll issue a couple of stern statements, maybe whack on some light sanctions, and then look the other way. And that strategy was actually really working in Ukraine until MH17. And this is what, again, like having been on the ground, we saw this in real time. Prior to MH17 being shot down, the Russian strategy was working. If you were looking at that conflict from the West, it was, you had the Luhansk and Donetsk, you had the LNR, you had the DPR, you had like random Cossacks making meth on hills. It was it looked from the outside like a very complicated conflict with like Ukrainians shooting other Ukrainians, but some of those Ukrainians were maybe Russian puppets, but it wasn't clear. And the Russians were very clearly intervening, as you say, and like they would just, every time the rebels got in trouble, as you said, they would just pound the Ukrainian positions from across the border with grads and uragans and artillery. And then the Ukrainians can't shoot back because it would have sort of crossed red lines.
Diplomatic incident, yeah.
Exactly. Well, yeah. So they were kind of very successfully able to convince the West that this is all just way too messy and too hard, and who knows who the good, like, is the Ukrainian government the good guys in a fight against the DNR? If you're sitting in the West and you don't know that the Donetsk independence movement is about 4 minutes old and run by an FSB agent, maybe.
Well, not just FSB agents, gangs as well.
Yeah, I mean, listen, but my point is, like, if you're in freaking Iowa and you're looking at this, you're like, wait, why would we? Like, who would we even be? And what's, like, this is all just way too hard. I can't tell who the goodies and baddies are. And so that strategy was working really well to paralyze Western engagement. It was all just too hard.
Do you think I'm sorry to interrupt, but do you think the fact that 2014 was an election year had a more demonstrable impact to that effect, that Man, it's an election year, and I have to explain this too to the American public. It's 2014. I don't know about this.
So it was the midterms
Yes.
in the US. Listen, having worked in diplomacy and having worked a lot with the US is always in the middle of an election. If you kind of think about it, the US is either in the middle of the midterms, in the middle of an election year, in the middle of the primaries, or they've just elected somebody, but they haven't got their people in place because everybody needs to be Senate confirmed. And so the US is like always going through some shit. You generally, on any issue, as I'm sure you've all noticed, on any issue with the US, you get like 3 weeks until the US finds a way to make it about their own stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like Ukraine aid is now like almost entirely about US internal dynamics, and then like Ukraine's like a third tier afterthought. Same thing with the you were talking about the protest before I joined the call. Like the US it took a few months, but it's managed to make Gaza largely about itself. It's now some fight about sort of college protests versus freedom of speech versus anti-Semitism versus wokeism versus has DEI gone too far versus campus police. Like, I don't know. And so the US is always going through its own shit. And the only way that you can have any hope of tapping into the vast power of the US sort of as an entity is to make sure that you have a narrative that is clear enough that it can cut through an incredibly noisy and frankly attention deficit disorder having US discourse.
I think that is true. I think having a strong, catchy narrative is important. And I want to talk briefly about your book. I do want to bring it back over to your book because these type of short, snappy narratives that catch people's attention are very important. If somebody's working a 9 to 5 and they have a few hours off, they got 2 kids they want to interact with, they want to help raise and have fun with, they want to watch their movies and want to watch their shows. It's probably very difficult from your perspective to pitch to those people that they should spend those few hours every day that they got free time for to sit down and understand complex trade arrangements, no?
Oh yeah. I mean, listen, it absolutely is. And even more than that, like, I don't think if you're the average person, I do not think you should necessarily be following trade developments day to day. Most of the big debates in my world just aren't that relevant to most people most of the time. The reason I wrote my book is I wanted to give people a resource that they could use to just, when it does come up, to at least have some sort of litmus test or North Star for like, okay, that sounds like bullshit. To basically just have a few foundational questions they can ask and understand just the general shape of how things work, to kind of to be able to just pass bullshit and pass things that are too good to be true, which voters are getting more and less sophisticated about in different areas, and this is my attempt to do it in trade. You could do it in a bunch of other areas too, and I think it'll be useful.
So your book is titled "Why Politicians Lie: How and What You Need to Know About It." It's a lengthy title, but I like its cover. So I wanted to just open with that as your title. Why politicians lie? I think we all know politicians lie, but why focus on the lying aspect of this? Why focus on the fact that politicians are lying to people about trade?
So the very honest answer is that wasn't the original title of the book. My editor was like, if you call this book what you want to call it, we will sell 2 copies.
What did you want to call it?
So I wanted to call it Sorry Trade Matters, which is like a terrible pun, but it's also because so much of the book is me just being like, no, I that this shit is boring. I get that like you would probably rather not hear about trade, but trade matters to a lot of the stuff that you do care about, whether it's stuff like issues like Ukraine, whether it's climate change, whether it's like jobs, and people keep lying to you about it. And so I'm trying to So like you do need to understand at least a little bit to know that you're not being taken for a ride. But I do focus a little bit on that last part of what politicians say about trade, specifically because I think trade is one of those things that's uniquely easy to lie about from a pulpit. Trade policy happens over a long time. If we sign a trade agreement tomorrow, you're probably not going to be able to measure the impact in any data for years, which means that you can say just about anything. Anything that happens as a result of trade policy is always multi-causal. You can always say, oh, but there were like 9 other things going on. So you can just say heaps of stuff that's like just not provably untrue in the moment you say it. And trade policy is also, and this is like the point of the book, trade policy, governments messing in business across borders is always about choices. You are always choosing between the interests of different groups, sometimes sort of within society, sometimes between societies, and all those choices involve trade-offs. And observing especially the Brexit debate, which is sort of my villain origin story in public life, I just saw politicians lying about those choices over and over and pretending they're not there. And I think the public sort of has a right to be treated like adults and judge the options politicians ultimately go with and where that led.
I wanted to follow up on a question, but you bringing up Brexit has me immediately. I want to bring this up to you because I'm not British, thank the Lord. But I wanted to ask, the polling data on Brexit has changed so dramatically, so quickly from an outside perspective. I remember Brexit happened, and it seemed like just within a few years, it seems like the majority of British people immediately regretted their decision. And now the data seems to suggest like 60 to almost 70% of the population thinks Brexit was a mistake. Is this a result of them feeling like they were lied to? Because I remember the NHS truck scandal, the big trucks that were going around like, if we leave the EU, we're going to save all this money on the NHS, and all these promises about what would happen if the UK divided itself from the European continent just didn't deliver on? Is it that they didn't get as much sovereignty over their borders as they thought they would get? What happened with Brexit that turned the British public so against it so quickly?
I mean, so first of all, when you say quickly, the referendum was in 2016. So it's been 8 years. This has been a journey, and those polls have trended downwards. I think a couple of things have happened. So first of all, both the original referendum and the polling now, it's almost impossible to separate how people feel about the government of the day and what's going on in the country. From time of the original Brexit referendum, a lot of the people voting were just trying to give the Prime Minister of the time, David Cameron, the finger. They were like, they didn't like him particularly at that moment. They thought he was a bit of a jerk. And so he was very much like championing the Remain case, and the referendum was a way to give him the finger. At the moment, you have an unbelievably unpopular conservative government in the UK. Like, I think Salmonella is outpolling the UK Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. And the Tories, the Conservatives, are inseparable from Brexit as a project. And so at least part of the anti-Brexit feeling is just people being like, well, I bloody hate you guys, and this is your totemic project. So I also hate that by extension. But yes, overwhelmingly, there was a feeling that people were deceived. People were told, first and foremost, that it would be that leaving the EU would allow the UK to significantly lower its immigration, both in terms of asylum seekers and in terms of just immigrants generally. And for a huge subsect of the voters on the right, that was a totemic issue. That absolutely hasn't happened. UK immigration is the highest it has ever been, and asylum seekers keep coming because they are entitled to, and that is what the Convention on Human Rights and Refugees says that they can do. They're actually well within their rights to apply for asylum, so yeah. So they feel like the borders aren't under control. It was an immensely, like, it completely paralyzed the United Kingdom for half a decade. The UK talked about nothing else. And then, as you say, none of the gains materialized. Fundamentally, if you kind of strip everything else away, Brexit, the premise of Brexit was, we in the government could make your lives better if we weren't constrained by being in the European Union and subject to its rules and procedures. It's been 8 years or whatever since the vote. We've tested that theory. The UK has left the European Union, and by like every imaginable standard, people's lives have not meaningfully improved. And in fact, by a lot of measures, they've gone the other way. So yeah, I think people feel pretty goddamn lied to. But there's a lot of other things going on as well. I don't want to pretend like 40% of the countries just had their eyes open and that's it.
Do you think that, and I don't want to stay on Brexit for too long, and I know we're kind of getting through this issue, kind of getting to the end point of this issue quickly, but do you think that there's any chance of the British government turning around? Of course, not the Tory government, not the current government, because they've, like you said, they've tied themselves to a lot to this issue. But do you think that public opposition combined with an opposition party like Labour coming in and replacing them, Keir Starmer's possibly, could lead to them reassessing their leaving of Brexit, saying, hey, we were deceived. The least we could do is maybe have another vote. But even if they did, what would that mean? I assume the EU would not be exactly smiling from ear to ear if those talks were to restart again. It'd probably be very frustrating for all parties.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, we should be clear that the Labour Party, who is the sort of up by 22 points and is the presumptive next government at this stage, has said that while they would sort of reassess their relationship with the EU in terms of seeking warmer relations and seeing where they could make the relationship work better, they have ruled out sort of rejoining the EU, at least under sort of the next couple of parliaments. And fundamentally, I think it's exactly for the reason you talk about. So the process of either leaving or joining the EU is like a half-decade long, all-consuming, incredibly faffy, incredibly not painful, but kind of painful negotiation and like machinery of government process. The public has no appetite for it. The genius of the slogan that Boris Johnson, who's now like 3 prime ministers ago, but who won the last election in 2019 for the Tories, he had the slogan of "Get Brexit Done." And the magic of that slogan is that it told the people who still really loved Brexit that he was going to like deliver it for them and that he was their champion. But it told the huge percentage of the country that just wanted to stop talking about it, just wanted to have the issue stop dominating all public life, all debate, have every issue be viewed through its lens, that this is going to stop. We're just going to put a full stop on it. Like, we're just going to get it done so that you don't have to hear about it anymore. And that's where I think most of the UK is at right now. It's not stake. The last thing the UK as a country has appetite for is like restarting that. We can't be having you leave and re-enter every time you have a switch of government from opposition to government. Like, this is quite annoying for us as well. So I think it would take like a decades-long process until you have something approaching a bipartisan consensus in the UK, or like overwhelming, I'm talking about like 70 plus public support for EU membership before you could even begin that conversation. With that said, I don't live in the UK, so maybe I'm getting all this wildly wrong. If there's British people in chat who think I'm a moron, they should continue to feel the freedom to say that. It's more often right than wrong.
Yes, well, I would consider condemnations by the British an endorsement personally. But I wanted to move on back to the question about lying, about trade. What are some of the most pernicious lies about trade that you hear the most often or most often repeated?
So there's ones that are quite, I'd say, quite innocent in that I think they make public debate dumber, but I don't know how much they hurt anybody. So almost any time you hear a prime minister, a president, a trade minister talking about how great their new trade deal is, chances are it does far, far less than they say they did. Trade agreements just don't tend to have a huge amount of change, and that sort of includes it includes NAFTA and all of the ones. Dishonesty in public life is always bad, but that's sort of bad, but survivable. I think some of the really big ones that the idea that tariffs, so taxes on imports, hurt people in other countries and not your own citizens. That's just simply not true. A tariff is a patriotism tax. It is a tax on you for not being patriotic enough when you are choosing products, because it is quite literally a tax on imports. So if you were more patriotic, you wouldn't have to pay it because you'd buy an American product, but you're choosing to buy a foreign product, so we're going to tax you. So that is what a tariff is. That's what they're for. And so I think that's like never the way you hear politicians talk about them, but that is exactly what they are. And that doesn't mean they're never appropriate. It doesn't mean you can never have tariffs. You can have, sometimes tariffs can be useful, but that's what they are. And that's like a really important point that gets buried in the like, we're going to hit the Chinese with tariffs. No, you're not. You're going to hit American consumers with a fine for buying Chinese products that if you weren't fining them, they would prefer to buy. So I think that's quite a pernicious lie. There's a series of lies that goes around about the idea that that there are magical solutions to regulatory and border frictions. So the things that make it really, really hard for small businesses to sell across borders don't tend to be tariffs. They tend to be paperwork requirements, customs, and that kind of thing. And the idea that you can wave a magical reform wand and make all of that more efficient is quite pernicious. The idea that we can somehow fight climate change, and to do it exclusively by being the ones who will build all of the solar panels and all of the electric vehicles and all of the wind turbines. The idea that we can defeat climate change but by creating green jobs, and that it's going to be this win-win where we defeat climate change and we do it while creating 1 trillion green jobs and no one has to make any sacrifices, just doesn't kind of work when you globalize it. You cannot have 194 countries in the UN. 194 countries can't all be net exporters of electric vehicles and solar panels. Someone is going to have to not produce those things, and politicians need to accept that that this isn't sort of a magical product we can all make. There's basically a bunch. There were about 1 million around Brexit, which I spent a lot of my time debunking live because people were saying some truly dangerous stuff. But yeah, I mean, this is the kind of flavor of it.
Let's break down a few of those. I don't know if I'm going to be able to visit all of them, but I wanted to visit a few of them. The first one I wanted to visit was the my trade deal is fantastic type of political move. One thing I wanted to highlight, and I'm not trying to pick on Trump too much here, but I remember NAFTA and then NAFTA Plus. And NAFTA Plus was just NAFTA with a few more bells and whistles attached to it. But it was the way it was discussed, the way it was pitched, the way it was talked about. He had made it seem as if he had taken this garbage, horrible, terrible deal that destroyed American workers and turned it into a deal that worked for everybody, that everyone would be happy with. And he stared down the Mexicans, he stared down the Canadians, and his steely resolve had finally made them buckle for America's economic greatness. And it was just the same legislation. It was just the same bill. I felt, I mean, I guess not as frustrated as I felt now to see basically the same Ukraine aid bill pass after 6 months of negotiating and talking, when it's basically the same bill. You could have passed the same thing again, or in Trump's case, just not done anything, really. At least, or am I wrong here?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think you're exactly on the right track. The NAFTA 2.0 was, I won't say an upgrade. They kind of tinkered with it. They focused a lot of their attention on one sector, which is cars. And what they basically did was they futzed around with, this is going to get really nerdy, with basically like the rules of origin rules. So basically, when a free trade agreement reduces tariffs, it creates an eligibility criteria for accessing that lack of tariffs. So what they're trying to avoid is, let's say, the US and Canada eliminate tariffs on cars. So there's no car tariff between the US and Canada. What they don't want is Canada importing 1 million Chinese cars and then sending them to the US by just adding a made in Canada sticker onto them. That's their nightmare scenario. So they create these rules that say, okay, we've got this free trade agreement, it eliminates tariffs, but in order for a specific car to use them, you've got to meet certain criteria, which normally means you have to be made in Canada enough to qualify for the deal. Like enough of the work has to happen, enough of the components have to be Canadian. What they did with NAFTA 2 is that they did something for the first time where they basically said that the workers who have worked on part of this car have to be making a minimum amount of money. So they imposed as a condition of using the tariff, basically like a minimum wage equivalent to like Canadian minimum wage across the deal. So what they were trying to do was basically target Mexican manufacturing to basically prevent it undercutting American cars on labor costs and price and taking advantage of this deal. There's absolutely no evidence this did anything apart from generate some work for the lawyers. The idea that it like changed the country or saved the auto industry is absolute nonsense. But it was like that kind of stuff. It was futzing around the edges. It was micro-targeting. It was like there's now like a process for if the Mexican, ironically, given who put this in place, dies, there is now a process under which you can sort of raise an issue under NAFTA 2.0, which is very funny if you think about sort of Trump's positions on unions generally and that kind of thing. But it's futzing around the edges, and it's exactly because these things just don't tend to do that much. And trying to sell them as a transformational tends to be quite silly.
I wanted to talk about green jobs quickly because, I'm a pretty progressive guy. I like the idea of solar panels and Mother Earth with a big smiley face on it, That's something that I like. What is the pernicious lie around electric vehicles or green jobs? Because personally, I don't see a problem with investing more in solar panels, investing more in wind turbines, investing more, reinvesting, I would say, in stuff like nuclear energy to try to get off of more dominant carbon-based energy production forms in order to try to fight climate change. I understand the idea of needing to coordinate it, but where does the lie come in when it comes to these green jobs?
Okay, so I 100% support all of those positions. God, like, pour money at it. I'm right there with you. And you want to encourage as many solar panels as you possibly can to be built and to be installed, right? You can subsidize, so you can give firms money to make solar panels. You can give your consumers money to buy solar panels. That's one option. But if you're not just interested in having more solar panels on planet Earth, but you are specifically interested in having those solar panels be built in your country, then the policy tools that you have available are trade policy tools that make it harder for foreign companies that make these things to sell them to you. So at the border, you impose taxes on them, you impose regulations on them, you make it harder. The challenge is that if everybody is doing that, we're not specializing anymore. We're not building them efficiently. Everyone is trying to create their own little walled garden where they are building solar panels kind of just for themselves and their little trade block. Whereas what we absolutely need to be doing is basically just building as many of these fucking things as we possibly can, efficiently better, and to just like flood the world with them wherever they come from, even if they're not made in the Rust Belt. Like a solar panel still generates good. Lie is that there is some way that we can simultaneously fight climate change, but by creating these borders, these barriers at our border, do it exclusively through our own labor and our own job creation. It's not going to work that way.
So what you're saying is that these are things that should be invested into, but nation states thinking that they can use this as an attempt to just build up their own green energy industry independent of the world, without having to import, foreign parts or have to rely on foreign markets or the markets of allied countries. That's delusion. That you can't do both.
Yeah, sort of exactly. So think about this, right? If you're a government and you want to create green jobs at home, right? Like that's your dream, and which is a perfectly reasonable dream. You can spend a lot of money subsidizing, but that is a hit to your budget. You have to like get that money from somewhere. What seems like the easy solution is that instead of effectively making it cheaper for our domestic producers to make solar panels, we're just going to make it more expensive for our people to get their solar panels from anywhere else. So they have to buy them from our guys. That's a much cheaper option in terms of like your annual budget, because you're not spending any money to do that. You're just putting up a border at the barrier. You're putting up a barrier at the border. So that feels like the more tempting option. And then to kind of the halfway house to this is that if you do, a lot of companies will say, okay, well, countries will say, okay, we're going to subsidize. So we are going to give our companies money to build solar panels, and that's good. But we want to make sure that that money stays at home. So we're going to necessitate that all of their components come from home. So all of their suppliers have to be local. And that just encourages inefficiency, that encourages kind of localization, that encourages no economies of scale. And we just kind of don't have time for that shit, because the planet's on fire and the ice caps are melting and the bears are on their little ice floats. And
I do worry about those Coca-Cola polar bears. I want to move. I do want to move a little bit off of trade for a bit, if we can.
please.
So back to Ukraine, because this is the topic that I know a lot of my audience certainly wants to talk about. Do you think that in Europe there exists the political will to take the war in Ukraine seriously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine seriously, and commit to it the resources that are necessary? We're seeing the Germans invest more. We're seeing other European powers invest more. Has there been a real shift in how Europe sees Russia, and is that enough of a shift for them to keep a strong political will for the foreseeable future on this issue?
So let's kind of bifurcate here for a second. Eastern Europe's always had the will. You're not gonna. You talk to the Baltics, you talk to the Estonians. They've always been taking Russia seriously, and which is why they've sort of been transferring huge percentages of their stockpiles. But let's focus on Western Europe, because I think that's where your question lies. I think the will is getting there among certain actors, but, and this is a huge but, these are not agile political systems, and these are not necessarily particularly agile processes. They are not good at turning on a dime, and they are not, this is why we are talking about production schedules that run into 4 years from now. These are not economies that are good at like, right, from tomorrow we have to start producing 500,000 shells a week. So that's part of the problem. The second part of the problem is that, as we saw with Hungary's kind of holding up the EU bill, the EU aid packages for a while, as we saw with the Polish farmer protests holding effectively stopping Ukrainian grain exports at the border and putting in place safeguards on Ukrainian grain exports. And as we saw with Republicans in the US, all of these systems are inherently vulnerable to bad faith sabotage and game playing. If every time the EU wants to do something, they first have to do a 5-month song and dance to work out what the right balance of threats and bribes are with Viktor Orban, that makes it very, very difficult to sustain a prolonged commitment. It also, frankly, we're always one crisis away from these guys getting distracted, is kind of my read. Already some of the attention in some places is fading. So, a second crisis anywhere in the region of any kind risks a further dilution. And it risks the Europeans continuing to do enough to keep Ukrainians sort of in the fight, which, I'm not a military expert, but one of the safeguards for Europe is that Russia has shown absolutely no competence in terms of promulgating a war significantly beyond the limits of their railheads. So if you're sitting there and you are a complacent European, you're like, well, yeah, okay, they've made some advances, but as soon as they get more than 100 kilometers from the end of their rail lines, all their tanks run out of fuel, their troops run out of boots, and they start starving. So can't we just afford to keep Ukraine gradually retreating kind of to about that point and see if that buys us a decade or two, and then maybe, Putin dies or something? I'm not advocating that point of view, just to be absolutely fucking clear. Like,
Gotcha.
I'm trying to,
You're trying to explain the complacency.
Yes, exactly right.
I mean, I understand this idea of, if just trade land for longer term peace or buying time for something to happen. But they've been waiting for something to happen on the issue of Ukraine since 2014. I mean, you could go back before that if you wanted to, back to the Orange Revolution, etc. But they've been waiting for so long, and it seems like the only things that are happening is that the situation continues to deteriorate, with the Russians continuing to try to push their advantage. And I guess like a lot of this comes down to whether or not Europeans believe Putin's word, that when Putin says Ukraine must be part of Russia, we must have this. And this is not something that just, territorial demands that he only keeps to Ukraine. There are many others in his government who have been open about the fact that maybe if they're not claiming territory in other areas, they claim allegiance. They might not claim Serbia as part of Russia, but they might want to claim the allegiance of Serbia. They might want to, the same way that if the way they talked about Ukraine, as if Ukraine's not an extension of Russia, then it must become Russia. And when Ukraine did not serve Yanukovych, did not serve the interests of the Russian Federation, then it had to become part of Russia. And I think if you look at it from this angle, then if you just believe Putin at his word, then there's not okay, give him a little bit more land and it'll be okay, because all you're doing is kicking can down the road. Do you think some people think that Putin doesn't believe what he says he believes in European capitals, that he wants really the same things they want at the end of the day?
I mean, they certainly believed that up until 2022, sort of February 23rd. I think, you were talking about before that, the situation in Ukraine's been deteriorating since 2014. The Europeans do not have that view. The Europeans had 2014 and they were like, okay, MH17, that was bad. And, we shouldn't have taken Crimea. That's a violation of the UN Charter. Bad. They slapped some sanctions on him. A year later, Germany is signing the contract for Nord Stream 2. Relations normalize. The Minsk sort of 1 and 2 agreements happen. They fall over, but you have a situation where a pretty successful counterattack by the what was at then the Ukrainian military. It was then called the anti-terrorist operation, the ATO, happens in sort of, I think it was like late 2014, 2015. The front is stabilized at what was the pre-February 22 borders. casualties largely fall away. So by sort of 2021 was one of the most peaceful in terms of like casualties periods in Luhansk and
I believe
Donetsk.
14 people died that year, I think.
Yeah, I mean, confirmed casualties, like, you got to take this with a grain of salt. But yeah, like fundamentally, there was still sort of like special forces guys playing tag with live ammo in the forests or whatever. It's not, and fundamentally, Ukrainian territory was occupied by effectively Russia. But from a European perspective, I mean, do Europeans really give a damn who owns Eastern Luhansk? Now may see it as part of a larger sort of geostrategic issue, but they didn't back then. They definitely just didn't. They might say so as their official position if you push them, but in practice, was it anything they were giving thought to in Paris or Brussels or Berlin? Absolutely not. So I think that there are plenty of people in European capitals who are just like, if we can just make him sick enough of this that he kind of freezes the conflict enough in some way that kind of lets everybody go home sort of unsatisfied, but the temperature dial goes back to where it was, which is like, 30 degrees rather than 100, or I can't do this in Fahrenheit. I don't know, like DEFCON 3 rather than DEFCON 1 will be, the Europeans would, Germany would love to be buying Russian gas again. Jesus Christ. Like, so from, I think there are certainly people who are like, oof, like maybe we can just make this all go back to where it was, with Russian oligarchs taking their mistresses to Milan for shopping and buying up property in London. Like there's certainly a strong line of thinking in that direction, I think.
I mean, from the Obama administration, it felt like they were all still trying to salvage the Great Reset when they pressed the magic button that made all of the animosity towards Russia go away. Do you think that this came from a position of naivety on behalf of, like, they just didn't understand the Russian interests? It came from a good place of them genuinely trying to find out, like, okay, what do the Russians want, so we can find some middle ground and try to avoid war? Do you think it was more of a selfish type of, this is too big of an issue to really confront on its own terms, it'd be much easier if the Russians just wanted a tiny piece of land instead of a geopolitical reshifting? What do you think, what was the main motivators of this malaise on acting on behalf of the Ukrainians, which we made commitments to?
I think so. Naivete is a really interesting word, because it was naive, I think, in a way, but it was almost like an incorrectly aimed cynicism. So if you look at this situation purely from like a rational perspective, you're like, okay, so you've got Putin who's sitting in Moscow. He is, according to some estimates, like the richest person on earth, because he effectively sits atop a giant mafia organization that runs the world's largest petro-gas sort of hydrocarbon state. That entire state is built around funneling money in every aspect of the country into the pockets of himself and the sort of pyramid that keeps him in power, keeps him and his cronies in power. It's making them phenomenally wealthy. They have no meaningful domestic opposition. They are phenomenally secure in their power, at least Putin is phenomenally secure in their power. They face no real external threats because they have a nuclear triad. If you kind of look at that from that perspective, you're like, these guys are good as long as we keep buying their hydrocarbons. So as long as we don't challenge their regime stability, as long as we're not sort of actively kind of trying to remove them from power, we can do business with these guys. I don't think some people did, sure, some in Europe did, but I don't think most Europeans or Americans thought Putin was like a good guy. They just thought they could have a purely transactional relationship with him where they work together on areas of common interest and they just avoid talking about the areas that they disagree. And they're like, if you just look at it rationally, Putin's sitting so pretty, why would he do anything to jeopardize that? Why would he do something insane that could make Europe stop buying his gas, that could mean his oligarchs can't go beach holiday in Cyprus? Like, no, he won't do that. We can work with him. Which isn't like, it's not a naive position in that they weren't assuming he was a better person than he is, but they did misread the fact that he wasn't viewing his situation in the same way, and his kind of yearning for this kind of imperialist legacy and his all-consuming paranoia was making him act in ways that didn't fit into their calculus. This is my sort of grand theory on US and European complacency.
I think a lot of people try to, people get very American-centric, or whatever country they live in, where if a world event happens and there is a president during that time, it is ultimately that president's fault for not controlling it. And I think a lot of people kind of boil it down to very simple terms. If this happened during this term, so therefore it is their fault. I think it was Twain that kind of described it more like, when you lead a country, it's going down the river. There's rocks, there's logs, there's issues that come towards you. When the American government was... Wait, 1 second. Sorry, somebody sent me a text.
No worries.
Huh. Is that true? Anyway, what was my question? I completely got thrown off. I'll just throw us to the next question, because you were talking about sanctions, you were talking about trade policy, buying the hydrocarbons. There are still European powers that are buying Russian hydrocarbons. Some of it's LNG, some of it's other exports, but there are still European powers that are doing that. There has been a big dip in comparison. I mean, a dip that nobody could have conceived of before the full-scale invasion. Is Europe finally shaking off Russian energy dependence?
I think, I think they are, and I am praying that they have learned a lesson here, and that they won't simply switch it back on if this crisis ever hits a period where they can get to be complacent and forget about Russia as a threat again. So I do think that they are shaking that off. Part of the ways that they are doing that, it is worth saying, is by running around the world and using, frankly, the power of their pockets to lock in other suppliers. So that is having some run-on effects. The reason you saw sort of inflationary pressures is that the way that Germany, for example, did its energy independence was not by turning its nuclear program back on, was by basically just running around the world and locking in, especially liquid natural gas contracts from other places that weren't previously selling to Germany. And it was effectively bidding those up, which had some interesting effects on energy prices for a while. So yeah, I do think they're moving away from that energy dependence. One of the things that we discovered, though, was both sides had overestimated the leverage that energy provided them over the other. The Europeans felt like Putin would never jeopardize the export revenue that he gets by doing something crazy. And Putin thought that Europe's dependence on Russian energy meant that they couldn't strongly respond to his craziness. And like both sides got that wrong. Putin was willing to take that risk, and Europe did respond and wasn't completely paralyzed. So it wasn't quite as impactful as both sides thought it would be.
The sanction dynamics of this war continues to shift as the many European powers, the American government, continue to try to kind of find the loopholes, close the loopholes, continue to have leverage to keep adding pressure to the Russians as the war goes on. I think they're passing like their 14th or 15th or 16th sanctions package or something along those lines. How is the sanctions dynamic around this war continuing to change this deep into it? Are there changes that are still going on that is legitimately adding more pressure? Or when you're getting to like sanctions package 15, is it just a question of bells and whistles at this point?
So there's a mix of both, and there's a lot of reasons to be frustrated about the sanctions regime. Though it is worth saying that like this shit's just really really hard. Like you get stuff like the day sort of the sanctions hit, Armenian exports of I think it was like luxury cars went up 760%. That's not because a Porsche plant opened in Armenia. Like it's not hard to work out what's going on there. But on the other hand, it is very difficult from a like international governance, the way things work perspective to nail down, well, like, okay, well, who's kind of Armenia doesn't have any sanctions on Russia. And so like is Porsche in the US supposed to like monitor every Porsche? Like Porsche sells something to Poland, that car is then sold to Armenia, and then that car is then sold to a dealer in Moscow. Like is the Porsche factory that built it in Dusseldorf ultimately responsible for that, meant to chase that down? It's hard. Some of what we've seen, so like the US just apparently really put the hammer down on financial institutions that have been sort of facilitating the procurement by Russia of things that are on the sanctions list. So this is dual use goods and military and goods with military applicability. So they've done a bit of that. I'm always just there, like, I think back to the war on
saw a
terror.
Financial Times article that was talking about this, and from the graphs that they were showing me, it seemed that it did have a real impact. It wasn't like nothing.
Oh yeah, no, listen, it's incredibly hard to do business with Russia at the moment. Sort of people I know in Russia who like, for example, who had a flat in Moscow and wanted to get the fuck out because it's Moscow and wanted to leave like Russia. In order to sell their flats in Moscow, what they were doing was they were selling them for rubles, converting those rubles into Bitcoin, transferring that Bitcoin into accounts they were opening in Dubai, which allows Russian citizens to open accounts with just a Russian passport and accepts influxes in crypto, converting that crypto to USD or whatever, or euros or whatever, and then taking it out. That is not a risk-free or hassle-free process. That if that's like what it takes to do business with a Russian, that's going to have negative impact. So it is having some impact. I just keep thinking back to like, again, maybe you're probably too young to remember this. During the war on terror, the US Treasury and Commerce got so serious about hammering terrorist financing that they managed to bully Swiss banks into transparency for the first time in human history. I don't know what they fucking said to the Swiss. I can't imagine it was polite, but they applied so much pressure in an effort to cut off the funding of Al-Qaeda that they were able to get the Swiss to commit to transparency in Swiss private banking. Like that was and I'm not sure that same level of energy and enthusiasm is being applied to thwarting Russia. It just doesn't feel that way. They're doing some stuff, but it feels very narrowly targeted, and they're like, can we stop missile components getting into Russia? Not the full court press that is US, like the US Commerce Department, the US Department of the Treasury really deciding to ruin your day.
I think one of the biggest examples of this is the amount of Russian assets that are related to the Russian government. So these aren't just like random Russians that have property somewhere, but people of power and influence. And these assets, which are actively producing money and could be seized and could be handed over. And there's a long conversation about the diplomatic and legal implications of that. But there's a question about deciding on the middle ground of, well, maybe we won't seize it all and give it to the Ukrainians. Maybe we'll take 90, not all of, but 90% of the profits and hand it over to the Ukrainians for them to do with as they wish. And even that conversation is being debated more because the Irish and the Hungarians and others who want to be quote unquote neutral about this are like, well, if we do that, then can the money not go to weapons, and can we get a guarantee it won't go to weapons? It feels like they find a middle ground, and then once they have the new middle ground, they have to find a middle ground between that in the last position, and they just keep finding middle grounds and half measures that are very unsatisfactory if you're also having a problem with financing the war, period, because you want to find unique ways to finance the war without adding to your own bottom dollar, but you also don't want to put in the energy to find those ways or aggressively pursue those ways. It feels like they want their cake and they want to eat it too.
I mean, there's always cakeism in this kind of stuff. There's also just like a lot of hand wringing about the legal and, I mean, diplomatic, who gives a damn, but like the legal implications of effectively expropriation of the assets of foreign citizens on your territory and the forced transfer of them to another government. People are sort of going all sorts of, what are going to be the implications? What's the legal mechanism we can use, and all this kind of stuff. Which at the end of the day, like, if there was a will, there would be a way. But as you say, when it comes to making the hard decisions on some of this stuff, I think politicians are balking at the last step. I think in part because of probably some pressure, like, in their ear. I'm not conspiratorial, but I think they're being lobbied very, very, very hard to not do this, and sort of the specter of Russian investment and Russian capital is Russian capital was a huge part of the foreign direct cash inflows into a lot of these places before the war started, and they remember that.
Do you think the American government can sufficiently pressure the Chinese in order to get them to stop sending things like drone components or missile components or electronic components to help the Russian war effort? I know a big thing was the CNC machines, which have really helped the Russian war effort.
Yeah, so kind of a no. So to an extent, actually, the US has been more successful than I think they sometimes get credit for in preventing Chinese companies with sort of a certain range of Chinese companies from transferring a certain range of components to Russia through the threat of secondary sanctions. Basically, for those who don't know, secondary sanctions, ordinarily a sanction is basically me saying to my companies, you can't do business with that government. Secondary sanctions are when you say, I will also take action against other companies in other countries that do business with that government. So the US and the EU are like the only kind of economic blocks big enough to make this a credible threat. And the US has had some success in deploying them, because what it basically says is, it said to some Chinese companies that do a lot of business with the US and the West as well, is basically going like, hey, listen, you can sell aircraft parts to Russia if you want, but then you will go on a sanctions list yourself. And you will be sanctioned as if you were a Russian company, effectively, and you will not be able to do business with the West. That has forced Chinese shipments from private companies underground. It has significantly decreased the flow. It's why Russian airplanes are falling apart, because they can't get the spare parts, because the Chinese private companies are reluctant to take the risk, the ones that have a lot of business with the West. What you can't stop is the Chinese government doing whatever the hell it wants to do, because, well, the Chinese government doesn't sanction Russia, and the US has a lot of limits on how much pressure it can apply on China.
Okay, let me get through the last questions and we'll wrap up for the night because it's getting quite late. What do you make of Russia and Ukraine's long-term economic health? Because a lot of what I'm hearing from economic experts and from people who tell me about how the Russian economy is kind of, they don't tell me necessarily it's a dead man walking, but a lot of the negative economic outcomes are not going to be felt until most likely the war is over. And so while we could talk about the short-term economic health for during the war, what type of impact will the war have once the guns stop firing and, they have to, make an account of what's left in the banks, what's left in the vaults, what's left of the Russian economy?
I mean, so setting to aside, obviously, but focusing on Russia first, they are, I don't know if dead man walking is the right phrase, but it is just very difficult to understand what the long-term plan here is. They are currently basically keeping their economy afloat by injecting government capital to effectively generate economic activity. They've put the economy on a war footing, which means that the government is constantly injecting money into all sorts of things, basically just throwing a bunch of money at manufacturing, at people, injecting a huge amount of cash into the economy, and that is keeping the economy going. That has a shelf life. You cannot do that in a sustained way. They're burning through their cash reserves. For the first time, Gazprom made a loss in the first quarter of, I think, this year. That, like, Gazprom, for those who don't know, is like the largest energy company in Russia, the one that sort of sells their natural gas everywhere. It's incredibly fucking hard to make a loss as a gas company. Like, it's not you pump gas and then you sell it. Like, it's literally like, I don't know. I don't know how you make a loss doing that, but they're making
Can you
a
tell me
loss.
about, can you explain the significance of them making a loss? Like, what does Gazprom mean for the Russian economy, and what does them having a loss indicate?
So the Russian economy has never been good at making things. It's not a manufacturing economy. It had a modest services sector, so it had like an IT sector in Moscow and St. Petersburg or whatever. But fundamentally, the primary thing that the Russian economy did was extract hydrocarbons, so natural gas and oil and precious minerals from sort of Siberia, and sell them abroad, and that generated foreign capital that they then sort of invest in other things. Gazprom operating at a loss means that they will now contribute $0 effectively to the Russian economy in terms of corporate tax, right? So if they are now operating at a loss, so this is like, it's like if you ran a petrol station and the selling petrol part of your business was operating at a loss. Yeah, you still have the concession stand, and yeah, you still have like hot dogs, but your primary business model is now costing you money every quarter. That is very, very, very bad. It also means that there is less, because this is like, it's not just important to their economy, it's a huge part of their exports, which means that there is less foreign capital coming in, and it puts further pressure on the ruble. Because to the extent that their contracts were delineated in rubles, in order to buy Russian oil and gas, you had to buy a bunch of rubles, which raised the value of rubles. If people are no longer doing that, the value of rubles continues to fall, which makes it harder for them to buy things abroad, which makes things even more difficult for the Russian economy. But they've also just killed all of their workers and driven out anybody smart enough to get out of the country. Like, that's also not good for the long-term future of an economy, one thinks.
And that's also while Russia was already in the midst of a demographic crisis in and of itself, with many people predicting that Russia had to find ways in order to solve the democratic crisis, immigration-based or family planning-based. And it feels like these issues are just getting compounded every day, every month that the war goes on. People talk about like a nation coming out of the other end of a war stronger. The United States was definitely stronger by the end of World War II. But I don't see any process or any result from this war than Russia coming out the other side of it much weaker, unless they can unless they really transform their strategies on the battlefield to a point where they can take over literally all of Ukraine and just absorb it into itself. Do you see any strategy where the Russian economy could come out of here looking pretty?
I really don't, because you kind of think through that chess game. And first of all, like, Russia's given no indication it can take and hold a major Ukrainian city that, like, very actively resists. Mariupol being probably the biggest example. You know, the idea that these guys are going to be able to take and hold Kiev with what they're throwing at it is ludicrous.
Another thing that people don't consider is even if they do take over these locations, they gotta sit there and actually rebuild it and invest in it if they want it to turn out productive economic capital.
Yeah, and they're so bad at like people give the US a lot of crap for reconstruction in Iraq and Afghanistan. But like the US system isn't entirely built on corruption of government procurement. The US has like other constructive streams of life you can go into. The entire Russian system is built on corruption. There are fantastic walkthrough videos you can find on YouTube of the like Potemkin apartment blocks they built in the parts of Ukraine they've occupied to show like what good neighbors they are. And these things are like insane. There's like toilets hanging out of the ceiling and shit because they've stolen all of the money and they're terrible at this. So yes, absolutely. They would have to do it while fighting a guerrilla war. There would, I mean, you know, even if you imagine the Ukrainian army is somehow completely defeated and like Zelensky is killed or fled overseas, there is going to be a robust resistance movement of people who speak flawless Russian, are visually indistinguishable from the occupiers, and frankly have access to Russian military uniforms because everybody was wearing the same thing like 35 years ago. Trying to fight an anti-insurgency against people who look exactly like you. Forget exactly like the populace, that's a given, but they also look exactly like you.
And have a direct highway system to your major capitals and cities in your own country.
Oh my God. And also, if Russia were to fully occupy Ukraine, the CIA would have quite a large part of the building dedicated to supporting whoever's slitting throats of Russian officers on the streets of Kiev. So there's kind of there'd be a lot of costs there, but also like, and then what? You've occupied Ukraine isn't like a giant gold mine. Ukraine's wealth lies in its agricultural sector. It has phenomenally productive agriculture and its people. Ukraine is a very well-educated country with a really innovative, really hardworking, talented people who, if history just left them the fuck alone for like 2 decades, would build some really kick-ass entrepreneurial companies. They're not going to be doing that under Russian occupation. They're not going to be selling a lot of freaking grain to anybody at competitive prices under occupation. So like there's no endgame, and it doesn't fix the core Russian problem, which is that their economy sucks and their biggest and most competitive customers for their oil and natural gas are refusing to buy it. Sorry. It's just really hard to square that circle.
Is sucks an official term? Is that an econ term?
It's a term of art, as we call it in the WTO. So it's you can minute that and have it appear in the formal record.
Thank you. Please take that down. Somebody take that down. I wanted to wrap up with this last question because the question of negotiation always comes up when it comes to the question of how this war is going to end, negotiating with the Russians, whether you're negotiating their literal just full withdrawal of the country or negotiating a deal that has this lane go this way, this lane go that way. At some point, there's going to be presumably some time where Ukrainian officials sit down with Russian officials and discuss some future between their two countries, even if it's completely antagonistic and it's just some sort of, we're going to just put this on pause till later. What is the best way Ukraine's allies could help prepare them and support them going into said negotiations?
So there's a couple of things that allies can do. Obviously, the most important thing is that Ukraine be negotiating from a position of strength. In Putin's interview from March, I think, where he was asked about negotiations, he was very, very blunt and said, why would I negotiate with Ukraine just because it's running out of artillery shells? So for one of the first key points is that Ukraine has to be negotiating from a position of strength, in the sense that there can be no perception on Putin's part that a failure of negotiations is a win for him in some way, or that the status quo is good for Putin. So from that perspective, obviously arming Ukraine is absolutely number one, continuing to robustly support Ukraine as number one. The more success Ukraine has on the battlefield and the more pain it can inflict on Russia, the stronger will its negotiating position be. That's one. Number two is similarly from a same sort of logic, not to be constantly making noises in European and US capitals, pushing Zelensky to the table. A huge amount of power in any negotiation, and I sort of say this as professor of negotiation skills, is for the person for whom it is a bigger problem for there not to be a deal. Every time you kind of hand wring and go, oh, you know, a peace in our time, and can't Zelensky just be reasonable, and surely there's a deal to be done here, you raise the costs on Zelensky for walking away, and that is effectively handing negotiation coin to Putin. So kind of continuing to make the robust statement that a good deal is whatever Ukraine bloody says it is, and that if the Ukrainians judge that what's on the table isn't a good deal or isn't being offered in good faith, then they're the best judges of that, and we're not going to be pushing them or lobbying them behind their back to accept more or accept something that doesn't look like what they need. And then the third thing, and this is the impossible bit, is if you are talking about any deal that doesn't start from the Russian army retreating in disarray over its borders, but instead you are talking about some sort of deal that freezes borders somewhere where they are now, which, by the way, not advocating, obviously, but if you kind of think about that situation, then the only way to make that work is with robust security guarantees. Because in terms of like any deal like this, in a normal treaty, there would be like enforcement mechanisms because you can trust the word of the parties. So if the US and Canada make a deal, they're both probably going to stick to it, and most of it under most circumstances. Putin has absolutely no fidelity to his international reputation as a man in good faith or to the concept of deals. You can ask Prigozhin how much a deal with Putin is worth, or you could if you could dig up what's left of him. Putin sees a deal as something that you hold to right up until you're in a position of strength to move against it. So what that means is that any negotiation with Putin, where the only enforcement mechanism, if Putin breaks his word, the only thing keeping Putin from breaking his word is his word, that will not ever work. So the only things that could keep Putin to his word in a deal like that are either if his military is so badly mauled that he has to retreat it back across the border and begin a multi-decades long rebuilding process, or if the West offers concrete security guarantees. So effectively a NATO Article 5 equivalent that says that we are not going to support Ukraine if it attacks in breach of this deal, but if we detect that there are significant Russian attacks across this border, we will intervene militarily. The West has so far been completely unprepared to offer those kind of guarantees for fear of appeasement, escalation, for fear of direct confrontation, and not wanting to risk their blood in addition to their treasure. But that is what's required.
I know I said this would be your last question, but this just hit me, and I realized I really should ask this.
No, go for it.
How did the 6-month delay in aid from America affect the West's negotiating position with Putin, or its negotiating position with other countries as well, if you wanted to make it more geopolitically, internationally inclusive?
Sure. So I think it actually had a lot of effects. I think from Putin's perspective, the signal was my strategy is working. This is now a war of attrition between Russia and Ukraine from his perspective. And he's looking at the delay and he's like, I can outlast these guys. the US is going to get distracted with its own stuff. I can outlast the West's commitment to Ukraine and just grind Ukraine down because we have a hell of a lot more infantry fighting vehicles and artillery tubes in stock than they do. So that was kind of from Putin's perspective. And I have to say, the kind of flooding the weapons back in, the passage of the bill is a good start. But if you're sort of sitting there from Putin, you're going, well, at the start of 2022, they were sort of saying our commitment is total and, whatever it takes, however it takes. And then a year and a half later, they were literally not sending anything. So I can outlast this, and who knows what will happen next. The US goes through these election cycles. Maybe they elect Trump. Maybe they elect an even margier Congress. Maybe they elect a Senate a really bad signal internationally. Oh, not bad. I mean, that's a subjective term. The signal it sent to the rest of the world is that the US, as a guarantor of global security, which is may not be how all Americans want to see themselves, but it's how America has been selling itself. And as an ally comes with an asterisk. And that asterisk says, we will have your backs until a faction of our politics finds a way to turn you into a wedge issue. If you got into a time machine and told somebody in 1998 that in the face of a Russian invasion in Europe, the Republican Party would be the ones trying to block all aid because maybe Putin's not such a bad guy, and by the way, he's a base trad wife loving Chad, they would punch you in the face as a time traveler of deception. But now any issue, if you throw it into the US political system and you give it a couple of months, someone figures out a way to fit it into the polarizing left-right dichotomy, and one side increasingly is able to grift economically, politically, and in the attention economy by championing it. And then that leads to paralysis. So I think that was the message that went out to allies, that it doesn't matter how much you share the US's stated and actual values. It doesn't matter what commitments you have on the table. The US as an ally has a giant asterisk over it. And you should reconsider your web of relationships through that lens. Which, and again, isolationists in the US would say, yeah, good. They should do that. Why were they relying on us? But for those of us who rather enjoy living in a comparatively stable globe underpinned by a US-led Western order, it's doesn't spark joy.
Was muted. Thank you so much for coming on to today's stream. I really appreciate it. Definitely considering how late it is, because I stream at an ungodly late hour over here in Ukraine. I appreciate you coming on. If you wanted to plug your book again, I'm Why Politicians Lie About Trade. I wanted to give you that opportunity. And if people wanted to find you or any of your commentary, where could they find you?
So by far the easiest place to find me is at Dmitry Opines. I'm sure one of your lovely Discord kittens can plug it into chat. And all of the links to the book and stuff and everything that I do. I have a podcast called Intrigue. If you liked me ranting semi-coherently about international affairs, I have a little podcast that I do with two other former Australian diplomats called Intrigue Explained, where we kind of break down a lot of these issues and try to sort of try to talk about them. And I mean, the book is me basically talking to you a little bit like this, like I would to somebody in a bar who asked me to explain trade policy to them. I try not to talk down to you, but I also try to try to give you what you need to know to be a informed consumer of the news and a participant in the global democratic debate.
Thank you so much for coming on. I might invite you again on in the future if you would be willing to come on again. I really appreciate you coming on today, man.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me on. Such a pleasure. And I should say, like, thank you so much for what you're doing. Like, it means the world to Ukrainians to have people give a shit about this stuff every single day, and you're putting your neck on the line to do it. Like, I'm sure you're getting this from like Ukrainians on the ground in Ukraine all the time. But let me repeat it one more time. What you're doing is amazing. What you're doing is important, and the fact that you're doing it 2 years into a conflict that a lot of people have gotten bored of or twisted into their own shit means a lot to a lot of people. So thank you so much and stay safe.
I'll try to. I'll do my best. I promise. Thank you so
Please.
much for coming on, man. You have a good one.
Thanks, man.
Bye-bye.
You too.